Our next speaker is Dr. Jesse Benjamin, who in 2018 won the Kennesaw State University Outstanding Teaching Award as a professor, associate professor of sociology who focuses on African diaspora studies, and who was also a recent recipient of the Georgia State University Office of Intercultural Relations Award, the Hosea Williams Award for Community Activism. Dr. Benjamin will be speaking to us today on the racial dynamics of a new conceptualization of an Islam-Judeo construct.
Yes.
And a return to that. Thank you very much. Please welcome Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, by the way, and I apologize. I don't want my absence up until now to be misconstrued. I'm busy organizing a conference around Walter Rodney this week, which is my work in the city, and I also have to leave shortly after this to get on the radio to talk about the horrific events in New Zealand, which, to be honest, is really on my mind and resonates through, I think, a lot of the work I'm doing, but I think a lot of us intersect with it because of our unique knowledge of where that kind of hate comes from. I really loved your paper, by the way, and it resonates a lot with my work. I'm going to present as much as I can get in before the time stops me. It's a piece I've been working on. It builds on, I started by working on I was asked to write about the relationship of North Africa to the origins of anti-blackness for the UNESCO Volume 9 History of Africa. And I went really deep into that paper, and it proliferated out into other directions. And so I want to use this paper and hopefully the publication that comes after it as a chance to explore specifically how this intersects with Jewish identity, but also with the rise of whiteness, because I'm looking at 500 years ago how the birth of anti-blackness and racism itself emerges, but that means also that's the beginning of whiteness, and those two things are inextricable. And it's pretty theoretical. I'll try to translate as much as I can into regular English, but I also wanted to write it in really strong theory because I feel like it's contentious and it needs to be able to stand on its own merit. But essentially, starting 530 or 40 years ago, I'm looking at a long period of the disruption of what I think is the Judeo-Islamic tradition and of more multicultural traditions, the ones you were talking about, that I think are much more indigenous and more common throughout the world. And it's the Western monocultural interventions that try to make a single identity of whiteness or Christianity or something like that. That seems to be the aberration. And the question really politically or in terms of policy is how do we restore those more transcultural, multicultural concepts, which really weren't disrupted until the 20s, the 30s, or the 40s. And so again, I resonate with the paper before me in that regard. So let me jump into my theory and try to explain what I've been working on. So the conventional Eurocentric origin story of modernity and its entire racial epistemology is generally decontextualized and stripped of its relationality with North African cultures and civilizations. And the entire world system, which was very vast at that point, to which all the latter pieces were fused. But just as Walter Rodney centered both relationality and agency in the title of his landmark volume, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, because I'll just say this, is that just by the title of his book, he put Africa and Europe in relation to each other, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Before and even after his study, people like to look at Africa and Europe as though they developed completely separately. But there's a lot of relationality in terms of political economy. In this case, I'm looking at the epistemic, the ideological links between the two. So the emergence of white Christian Europe and its hegemonic Western epistemology must be approached relationally and with attention to agency and power. North Africa was far more central in the rise of the fundamental concepts of modernity and their development and proliferation than most mainstream narratives concede. The cultures, societies, and states of North northern Africa were historically important and deserve renewed attention in their own right. And in relation to nascent European city-states, they represented one of several key conduits of social and economic connection into a world system of contiguous regions and civilizations encompassing almost all of Africa and Asia, and basically what we know as the Old World. In the early 14th century, for example, Ibn Battuta, who you all know well, traveled the entire world from his home base in Tangiers, Morocco, including multiple pilgrimages to Mecca, circumnavigations of West Africa, the Red Sea in Arabia, the entire Swahili coast, which is my area of expertise, the Levant, the Indian Ocean, most of South and Central Asia and China. He also traveled through Iberian Al-Andalus shortly before his fabled trip to Timbuktu and the Kingdom of Mali. There was an inherent and widely generalized fluidity in the construction of social identity and culture in the millennia leading up to the point of colonial disruption and reorganization that came quite a bit after Ibn Battuta. It allowed travelers like Benjamin of Tudela, Ibn Battuta, and thousands of others involved in commerce, trade, the production of knowledge, and myriad other interchanges to negotiate their identities and occupy multiple layers and cultural inflections simultaneously. The designation Moor or Moorish, like Habesha or Zanj, which I've written about, Abyssinian, Sud or Sudanese, they all indicate multivalent, geographically dispersed and flexible, yet regionally associated identities, epitomizing what a scholar I really likes, his formulation. His name is Moraes Farias. And he explains these were normative, at that time, before Western epistemology, these were normative, mobile, classificatory labels of non-Western epistemologies. So people didn't think of identity in the Western way that we do now. And that's one of the things that I would dialogue with your presentation is that when we see this exclusivist Arab identity and national identity, it's not ancient and indigenous. In fact, it's absorbed a key part of the colonial mentality that it resisted, ironically, and is now enforcing. And so to decolonize the coloniality of that would be to return to this more fluid sense of identity. However, a rigid fixing of identities around inverted boundaries produced by reductive Manichaean binaries. So it's this fixing of identities, invented boundaries, binaries, and hierarchies, and then the intense suppression of its own interrelatedness outwardly with the rest of the world. These are fundamental to Western thought and appear consistently. This spatio-temporal regime then allows multiple immaculate-seeming conceptions of thought. That's what I call it, immaculate conceptions of thought, industry, and state. So as though the West emerges, its thought emerges, its industry, its economy, its state just comes out of nowhere, as opposed to actually emerging in relation to and by cutting off its ties to the world that is now pulling away from and trying to colonize and dominate and exploit. As if without history are created whole and thus confirming its own greatness, relationally, by then discovering, inventing, creating industry, having virility or rationality. The suppression of African and all non-Western histories is central to this epistemology, as is the imagined unilineal evolutionary grid underpinning it, creating manifold volatilities that persist in culture and politics today. In the minds of the conquering crusaders of the Iberian Reconquista, North Africa and the contiguous Middle East occupied a central role in the earliest formations of what was becoming Western epistemology, and thus with the subsequent proliferation of meanings of blackness globally. Concepts of blackness as a fluid descriptive term had long existed in numerous Old World contexts, generally as an episodic descriptor, irregular in its meaning, more often positive than not, although negative meanings had emerged. Blackness was rarely seen as determinant of character or humanity or power in these discourses, and its meaning hardened into generalized negative associations and concomitant exploitation in only a few rare instances, such as during the Sudan slave trade or in the context of the Zanj Rebellion in Mesopotamia. However, this all changed at the dawn of modernity when North Africa and its peoples were represented as primary forms of an emergent notion of racial otherness, constituted in relational differentiation from Proto-European Christian whiteness, a formulation that has fluctuated and deepened and remained axial until our time. The initial disruption of the societal norms of West Africa and wider African Old World civilizations by the violent dispossessions of the Reconquista culminated in the late 15th century coupled with a newly emerging monocultural theocentric epistemology, and marking the rise of modern biocentric racial categories and coordinates in the world, these conceptualizations played a crucial role in the later rise of Europe as an entity and a concept. Mediterranean and Afro-Asian societal concepts and practices were denied, suppressed, appropriated, and incorporated in this new colonizing society and extended, formalized, transformed, and intensified into what rapidly became transatlantic and global concepts of modern racism centered on plantation-based racial chattel slavery and other extractive capitalist relations. Shortly after the Reconquista and the rise of the Spanish and Portuguese global empires, Northern Africa found itself to be one of many fast proliferating zones of contact between the growing capitalist empires of Western Europe and the places they were thinking they were discovering and trying to plunder and colonize. So I'm tracing the origins of this monocultural exceptionalism and nationalism back to this 500-year epistemic thought structure rupture that takes place, but it clearly sounds a lot like what you were talking about since the 30s. So there's an affinity there that I want to explore, and I hope others will as well. Significant advances in understanding the origins of modern concepts of race have been made in recent decades, with a growing consensus locating its origin in the Iberian Reconquista and the almost simultaneous conquest or conquista in the New World, where both processes institutionalize the emerging difference-based epistemic concepts. This is the idea that in our self-other world, that to understand the self and the other, it's all based on not just difference, but a negative relation. I call it relational negational concept of difference. So you understand difference relationally, but you negate that difference as an inherent threat. And I don't talk about it here, but the solution to that is best identified in the work of people like Audre Lorde from a very different set of texts, but the idea that difference can be restored to its centrality as a positive rather than as a threat, and that would address a lot of the problems that we have around forms of hate that have emerged in our modern world today. Islamic Iberia and contiguous North Africa, both with close ties to the vast systems of old world civilizations, were important cultural confluence zones between the Mediterranean and Africa, and soon also the Atlantic world. Using Geniza and other historical documents from Jewish Mediterranean communities, Schorsch, a scholar I really like, he shows that categories of blackness clearly already existed in Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultural, theological, and juridical thinking well before the Atlantic passage of Columbus and so on. However, blackness was not yet regularized as having negative connotations, though it may be seen to have been trending in that direction in some of the Mediterranean regions, and it's an important point for us to figure that stuff out. Nor was blackness a fixed category with stable meaning or definite geographic ascription. I'll read a little bit more, and then maybe some of this will come up in the Q&A. Rather, it was a highly variable category to the extent that it surfaced in writing or discourse at all, and was more often ascribed positive than negative attributes. It's hard for us to imagine that given the world we live in today, because we're such an anti-black world and anti-black discourse, and then anti-other, so all the others, it's very hard to imagine as non-demonized. Moraes Farias helps explain that pre-Western and non-Western epistemic categories conceived of identities more as mobile classificatory units of analysis shifting over time. They appeared in multiple places. They were not attached to people's bodies or to spaces, and you could see Zanj or East Africans in West Africa or other places. Sometimes it really was Zanj culture. Sometimes it was just imputations of culture. So there was a lot of fluidity and changing categories. People could have multiple identities at the same time without being considered contradictory. Terms like Moor in North Africa, Zanj in East Africa, were neither routinely negative or positively associated, but nor entirely tied to specific places. Frequently, these categories overlapped across the vast expanses of the African continent, throughout South Asia, and into the Indian Ocean. So, to me, this was the normative Judeo-Islamic tradition that was very ancient. Today, we have a Judeo-Christian hegemony in the world, and it affects us discursively in a lot of ways. And in my research on that subject, it's interesting to try to figure out where that even arises. It's largely a small sort of process that develops in the 19th century under the British and the French during their colonial periods, but it's not central to their projects. And I do argue that under U.S. hegemony since World War II, it has become absolutely central to imperial self-concept and so on. One of the things I glossed over here is that during this Inquisition Reconquista period, the agents of Satan, the Christians, the Catholics identified were Jews, Muslims, Moors, women, witches, infidels, heretics, even the left-handed. These were the groups that were considered to be the others, and this is the emergence of our modern biocentric body-based notion of alterity or difference that a lot of the modern world's concepts are based on. So I don't have time to go into that more. Let me see if I can find a final paragraph to read you to serve as a summation of some of what I'm doing.
How about a final sentence?
Yeah, a sentence or so. One conclusion might be that this region's ancient and illustrious Judeo-Islamic tradition remains largely suppressed, almost tacitly illicit in the racialized Western epistemological order of the past half millennium, even though it is a far greater world historical consequence than the now vaunted Judeo-Christian edifice upon which current world powers posture. Though universalized as ancient and natural, the recently hegemonic Judeo-Christian concept can be traced to post-World War II U.S. geopolitics and empire building, with slight 19th century British and French Oriental imperial politics and discourse origins. What would a Judeo-Islamic framing for modernity or for our futures mean? What are the implications of decentering Judeo-Christianity, deconstructing its relationship to empire, rethinking its international links to the world order? So I'll end there.